Hello, welcome to this Radio 4 style debate that I'm going to get going on between these two. I've got Jacob on my left and William on my right. We're going to talk about regulation and startups and hopefully not agree with each other too much. So kind of arguing in terms of maybe why we shouldn't regulate startups. Will, do you want to go first?
Yes, indeed. Let me sort of take the context that people have that in Europe we like to look at the impact that people have and then decide whether to regulate. In America, in Silicon Valley, we have the view that we sort of move fast, break things and so forth and that, and don't particularly worry about the consequences in that. And generally the Silicon Valley view is don't regulate because you're getting in the way of innovations. My view is that every time that the market has been abused, we've seen things go wrong. So let me give me a context. Regulation is normally fought back by the technology companies on the basis that it's against free speech. However, there are two forms of regulation. There's the free speech one, which is generally considered good, and then there's the markets one, which people then tend to work on bad. Now, the technology companies tend to assume that we should be avoiding regulation because they hide behind free speech. In fact, actually, the one that we need to separate out is free speech from markets. And for example, around the world, Google has 91% of the search market, etc. If you go back over a century, any time that there's been market concentration, there's been abuse. Prices have been pushed up, etc. So, and jobs have been lost. Just look at the American campaign last year. So, as far as I'm concerned, regulation is a good thing to do away with the ills of monopoly powers, etc. It's my start.
It's a very intellectual answer. Jacob, why shouldn't we regulate startups? Let's focus on that.
Regulation is quite of a double-edged sword. The reality is that one, on the one hand, could say why regulate? Regulation goes against the creation and the creativity and the innovation of all of us. That really, when we have an idea, we really want to develop it, no matter what happens. And we know we've seen wonderful ideas that have succeeded outside of the regulatory world, from starting with the fintech, or Uber, or Airbnb, or what have you. There's plenty of examples where we can say that thanks to the non-regulated framework have actually flourished, have emerged, have been created. However, not because governments are here for something, but the fact of the matter is that at the end of the day, governments need to endeavor for at least a framework of that encompasses things like safety, health, minimum elements so that the citizens are well covered. So on the one hand, one could say, yes, you have to go for regulation. On the other hand, one could very well say, do not go for regulation because otherwise you will be castrating the creativity and the innovation capabilities of the entrepreneurial gang of that matter. So it's a bit of a balance that one has.
Bit of a balance. But if, let's take the case of, you mentioned Uber and Airbnb. If regulation had been stricter around, let's say, property kind of behavior in cities or sort of around the taxi trade, we would have no Uber, we would have no Airbnb. These are obviously controversial companies, but at the end of the day, consumers really love, and there's demand for these two companies. So why is there really an argument for stricter regulation when actually we would, stymie innovation like Uber and Airbnb, which have been hugely successful, whatever you think of them?
Okay, well, let's take Uber as an example. The Uber business model is to drive competitors out of the business by using their many billions that they've raised in order to underprice the local market. So anybody who's a local car company's got no chance because they are being competed against by someone who is pricing below cost. Every single example where a dominant player has gotten power, they've generally squeezed the competition out and then pushed prices up. If you look at the Google, Microsoft and Cisco's growth, a lot of it had to do with acquisitions of innovative companies. If those companies had grown on their own, we would have had a more competitive environment.
So, I'm going to play devil's advocate for Uber, but, you mentioned the kind of billions from venture capital. No regulation is going to stop billions in venture capital flowing to Uber. So what would be your solution? How would we regulate something like, venture capital is all about taking a risk. It's all about finding the next big thing. It's all about investing in the entrepreneur who's going to be aggressive, who's going to have, going to play on a side of a line when it comes to regulation. There's no doubt that Uber's done that. So what would have been your solution to prevent exploitative practice?
If you take the Goldman Sachs advice to their investors is to basically invest in companies that have an oligarchical sort of position in the market. They recognize that's the way you eventually get the high prices in that. The only way you can do it is where you see market growing beyond the size. If you think about it, in media, we don't allow a company to get dominant. In other areas, so we prevent domination in other sectors. We just don't do it in technology. Why is that?
Don't want the monopoly?
Well, we're beginning to see the issues. If you see, for example, Senator a few weeks ago from Louisiana questioning the lawyers from Facebook and Google, say, you know everything about me, but you don't know everything about your advertisers.
But
that came about because of, power.
That's on quite a high level. Facebook and Google have obviously got to a very high level. They've really kind of gained the market share, and I think, I think many people in this room are probably not at the level of Facebook and Google. They're sort of, where Uber may have been 5, 6, 7 years ago, kind of still at the beginning stages and maybe being frustrated by regulation. So, is there maybe a compromise where at the early stages you don't kind of have regulation to sort of strangulate innovation, but you do have something at the higher level to prevent, Russia using Facebook to swing the US election?
Definitely. I mean, and I think that's the way it's actually being articulated at the moment. If you look at the antitrust laws that take place in the European Union, or if you look at those that apply in other developed OECD markets, it's obvious that there's a moment in time when regulators have to come in. The issue here is to what degree do we let the freedom of thought and freedom of creativity and entrepreneurship actually develop itself without interference of the regulators. The issue here, I think, again, it's about having or looking at a very fine line between regulating or the regulation or the interventionism. Sometimes regulators or governments go beyond that line and become actually very much interventionists, which actually, as I said before, castrates any sort of potential creativity that could happen. Having a framework is important, but definitely up until a certain point. There's something really interesting taking place now, which is everyone that is familiar with the banking industry knows that yes, the fintechs are a threat. Yes, the Googles and the Amazons and the Apples of this world are a threat to the banking industry, except that the banks say, I'm sort of protected because there's a regulatory body of laws that really protect me against them getting into this. Early next year, PSD2 is taking place in Europe. And PSD2 means actually that the banks will have, provided that the customers will allow for, will have to open their files to the world. And that is quite interesting because it's actually the regulators that are deregulating closed platform without where the banks. So what's really interesting is that we see at the end of the day that the regulators are actually seeing the benefit of not being interventionist and actually freeing the market so that creativity and the market itself allows for the development of products for the, at the end of the day, who's the important guy, which is ourselves, which are the person, the customer.
Since we're in Europe, I'm going to talk a little bit about Europe. There is no, this might be controversial, but I would say there is no direct equivalent to Silicon Valley. There's no direct European rival to Silicon Valley. I know London, Berlin, they all like to, and increasingly Lisbon, like to position themselves as rivals. But we don't have those kind of venture capital dollars. We haven't created the Facebook and Googles here. Do you think that is partly a fault of regulation where sort of in the US, Uber, for example, was allowed to grow in this very unfettered way and only really began to run into greater regulatory trouble once it spread out beyond Silicon Valley? How much do you think regulation is actually stopping Europe being able to sort of build its own answer to Silicon Valley? Well, I'm looking at you.
Well, I don't entirely agree with the thesis. More technology companies were set up in London this year than Silicon Valley. Spotify and originally many other companies, Skype, for example. There's a lot of innovation. I think we need to be clear that innovation mustn't affect the beginning of a business. Innovation allows for entrance to a market. The only way you're going to break the financial sector is through innovation from outside. And so you need a regulator to do that, otherwise the banks would keep people out. The issue about startups in Europe and venture capital is a cultural thing rather than a regulation. It has nothing to do with regulation, in my opinion.
Mm-hmm. And Jacob, I'll look at you for the same question.
I think really addressing or associating the development, the sheer difference in technological and innovative environment or ecosystem that we have, that we see in some markets like America or like Israel or like other, compared with Europe, and linking it uniquely to regulation is oversimplistic. I think there's a very powerful link between the universities and the private sector, the tax system, the development of the venture capital industry that has allowed America, America to really be the source for all these flourishing innovation or other markets, compared to Europe, where some people could say that it's only due to regulation. I think it would be unfair to blame it on regulation. I think a lot of the headway that America or other countries have in this regards have to do with many, many other circumstances, as well as regulation, but many, many other circumstances that have to do with the fact that as I said, the tax system, the way the universities are getting close to society and provoking and enhancing innovation, or the private funding, et cetera, that have really accelerated that compared to Europe, which is lagging behind, not stopped, but lagging behind America or other markets.
I'm going to throw up a very niche policy question next. We've managed to go 10 whole minutes without mentioning the word Brexit, but it's now time to break that silence. So the UK is obviously, at some point, unknown in the near future, leaving the European Union, and that's going to have very interesting long-term impact for startups who, I definitely speak to startups who are thinking about it now. You get many European entrepreneurs. I'm going to use the example of French entrepreneurs because they're the ones I've been speaking to, who have said, I left France at a time I found the regulatory environment very difficult, labour laws and so on, and tax laws. And I came to London as an area of sort of fairly open regulation. And now with Brexit, I don't know what's happening. So what do you think the regulatory environment for startups will be post-Brexit, potentially? If you were to sort of look into a crystal ball, how might it look in 10 years' time? Do you think we'll have a more sort of heavily regulated environment, for technology, finance, and startups, or do you think it could be more light touch to encourage that sort of innovation?
I think, in a word, I think it's going to be identical. I think that the world is slowly coming together in a common view of regulation. You just take a look at the Paradise Papers and the whole tax shelter thing. There's a world that's coalescing around a sort of commonality of attitudes in societies about regulation, abuses, and that. I would be incredibly surprised. The price of being part of access to Europe post-Brexit will be to respect the regulatory environment. The price of any trade deal with America or Australia, that will be to respect their regulatory environments. All the regulators in those countries these days fundamentally liaise with one another. So I'd be incredibly surprised if, for me, life will carry on.
Optimistic view of a hopefully similar future environment.
I'm
Jacob,
Irish.
what do you think?
I just could not listen.
Acoustics.
What you repeat? Yeah.
So my question was sort of how do you think the regulatory environment in London may change after Brexit for startups? After Brexit.
Oh, God, after Brexit.
He laughs, but the British people laugh.
Brexit is we could talk for ages about Brexit, and to what degree do you want a country to commit suicide? And some ones, you have it in Britain or you have it in Catalonia. People want to commit suicide, let them commit suicide. To me, the big issue with Brexit is the big issue. The big immediate issue with Brexit is the availability of talent, and to what degree talent will disappear or will have to leave Britain because they won't be able to to continue living in Britain. I would be amazed if that is the case, and I would be amazed if talent and potential talent will be allowed to leave Britain. On the one hand, universities will not let that go. I mean, I know there's a number of universities very much worried that professors are either not considering coming to Britain because of Brexit or considering leaving Britain because of Brexit. I will be very surprised if that actually is the case, and if Britain will continue on a spree of committing suicide and on a xenophobic approach to talent. There's a certain degree of one has to understand that the older generation might have had the reasons for voting Brexit, but the younger generation did vote totally against Brexit, and the future is in the younger generations. And I really think that that sort of regulation will not hinder the development of entrepreneurial spirit that has to continue existing in Britain. So my bet is that I don't think it will affect.
Where do you see as the most positive regulatory environments for startups in Europe? Sort of, it's very different market to market. Sort of, France is so different from the UK. Germany is different again. If you were a startup, if you were just starting out, where would you go and why?
Well, I have a business that's in London, various American cities, Canada, Beijing, and India, right? And as far as I'm concerned, London is the best regulated and the lightest regulated environment in the world in which I operate. I was very surprised when I first went to America, assuming it was the land of the free.
Specifically for advertising and kind of
just
creative.
Digital. I mean, we cover technology in that, and so I thought America would be the land of the free and unregulated, and I discovered that with city, state, and federal laws, it was a complete nightmare. So in fact, Silicon Valley quite often operates in spite of its, sort of those sort of structures, right? So for me, London, as far as I'm concerned, is the best place to start a business. I've never had an issue there. I don't think it's going to change. I think the things that I worry about, for example, are things like technology companies not wanting to take responsibility for the impact of what they do. They just feel that disruption is the end game, and that's okay. And I think that disruption is okay where you're disrupting a market. If you then disrupt in a way that's negative, for example, we don't want to have medicines that are unregulated. We don't want food unregulated. So why do we want technology unregulated and its impact when it's negative?
And Jacob, my question was...
London would have not become London if it wasn't because of the freedom and the easiness. And that's also why we have an office in London. And having an office in Mumbai, having an office in San Francisco, I realized absolutely the American, not to talk about the Indian red tape, but the American city, federal, state, etc., is a bloody nightmare. And the UK, everything is much simpler and the speed and everything. As I said before, London has become London for a particular reason, and the availability of talent and the availability of the easy and the flexibility and agility that one has in the environment that one can think in London and the UK is paramount wherever you go. So I don't foresee any changes that will be ridiculous.
Very optimistic picture for the UK even after Brexit then, which is always very good to see. I wanted to talk a bit about, you sort of mentioned about companies taking responsibility. So this is more going to be about technology in general rather than startups. But earlier at Web Summit today, there was Margareta Vestager. She's the European Competition Commissioner. Not an everyday household name, but she's the person who's been fining Apple and Google and Amazon huge amounts of money because of kind of ways they structure their revenue, sort of structuring it all through Luxembourg, and kind of having these kind of sweetheart tax deals. Now, she's sort of come in at this late stage and slapped in these kind of heavy, 1 million to 200 million kind of euro fines. But these are kind of drops in the ocean for tech companies. So is there a point where regulation maybe should have stepped in earlier for these kind of big, as you say, sort of almost monopolies, and actually regulation's acting? Is it possible that regulation acts too late?
I think the answer is that the environment and technology of which this community here in Lisbon is one that has basically flourished unknown to the government structures of the last 20 years. And it's only this past 5 years that people have realized that actually this community here is creating the jobs of the future and the wealth of the future. Apple's figure as foreign reserves at the moment is the same as the US and UK combined. So the fact that technology companies have become states in themselves is something that people didn't think through at the beginning. And that was fine because, you know, innovation should just flourish. But I think now we have a situation that parts of the world are trying to understand how they regulate. And of course, intervening in something you don't understand is always a recipe for disaster.
Again?
What can I, absolutely. I mean, and it's, I don't think one could one anticipate what happened and how one could talk about Apple, one could talk about Google, but if you look at Amazon and how Amazon has developed and have grown, I mean, not just on the B2C, but particularly on the B2B and the web services that they've developed, no one could have anticipated that would happen, and it will have to be tackled eventually by the government.
So possibly all sort of a good thing, but no one could have seen all this stuff coming. And do you think, you know, sort of where does regulation come in terms of startups? You know, when we were speaking backstage, Jacob, you talked about big corporates working with startups. Kind of, how can that kind of help startups kind of navigate this difficult world of regulation? For example, in fintech, you're a fintech startup, you're not used to dealing with all this stuff. Where can a big corporate come in and kind of really help you innovate?
Well, the relationship between big corporates and startups is one that cannot be anything else but learning from what and how they can disrupt me or I can disrupt them. It's because we know that we will be either disrupted or we will be disrupting. I mean, it's either two. The big issue here is, to me, one of agility, and to what degree the big corporates will have the dynamism and agility and the system or the weight to really react to what the more entrepreneurial startups will be bringing into the party. Obviously, what they do is end up acquiring them and incorporating them to the business, which is the easiest way. But the problem with that is that as soon as they acquire them, the whole spirit disappears because the culture of a big elephant or a big dinosaur really dwarfs the other one. So I think it's a matter of, as everything grows and the startups stop being startups and actually grow to a certain size, is how actually they relate to the big corporates. And that's something to be monitoring in the coming years or so, months or so.
Will, any thoughts on whether big corporates can help startups navigate the regulatory environment?
I think very much so. I mean, and the analogy I would use is India and China. You wouldn't dream of doing business directly on your own initially in India or China without a local partner, which therefore means that you're helping that community develop, but you're also getting a market opportunity yourselves. The challenge comes really when the startup gets to be of substance and whether the VC at that point, which is part of the mix, sells out to the big company and all that. So that's not a regulatory issue. That's more a cultural one. In Europe, we tend to sell out earlier. In America, we tend to want to go bigger. So, you know, Instagram, for example, you know, was sold out at whatever it was, $1 billion, and what would it be today? Is an example. You know what I mean? WhatsApp went for $19 billion. What's the difference between the two?
On that note, I will say thank you very much for this very wide-ranging discussion. Jacob and William, thank you so much. Thanks so much for having us.
Thank you.